Welcome back to Journalism 102 and this exploration of how to shoot a basic video story. So I call this Basic Video Top 10. These are 10 tips or tricks that will help you shoot better video from the start. So the very first thing that you need to recognize about video is that the more stable your video shots are, the more professional it will look. So that's really what sets the amateur home video of Christmas morning apart from the story about Christmas shopping that you might see on the news, is that the video is very stable. There's not a lot of what we call shaky cam. And the best video journalists do this by using a tripod whenever they can. So some of you may have a tripod that came with the camera that you're using. Even smartphones, they now make tripods that work well with smartphones, flip cams, Kodak ZI-8s, whatever it is you're using. There is probably a tripod that would work with your device. But if you can't use a tripod, you need to look for sort of natural tripods in the environment. So a few ideas for you is if you're trying to shoot a wide shot of a room, let's say, you might steady the camera against a wall. Or you might use a pile of books on an interviewee's desk to brace the camera against in order to stabilize that shot. If you are trying to shoot interesting angles and you want a lower angle, maybe there's a bunch of children playing a game, you might want some good shots of their feet coming in and out of frame. So sit on the floor and use your arms and knees, what we used to call crisscross applesauce, as a makeshift tripod. Or if all else fails, there's nothing to steady it against, you've got to be standing up, then hold the camera in both hands with your elbows tucked in close to your side to add stability when you're shooting. So the whole idea is, whenever possible, is to try to keep that video from moving all over the place and looking like you were running through the house to get the pictures. Number 2 is to avoid the zoom. So, as a friend of mine points out, Spielberg and Hitchcock both made amazing award-winning films without using a single zoom. And that goes for pans or tilts. So we say don't do it unless it's motivated. So a pan is basically moving the camera from side to side. So a time when it would be motivated is, let's say you're doing a story about how popular a new video game is and people are lined up outside of GameStop to buy this video game. So in a story like that, it would be perfectly appropriate to pan down the line showing just how many people were there. If you were trying to show how tall a new structure is, tilting the camera up to see how high in the air that new building goes would be appropriate. But what we find with people who are shooting stories for the first time or fairly inexperienced at shooting stories is they think movement is always good in video. So they think, well, if this picture in the art gallery is going to be a lot more interesting if I use the little digital zoom on my camera and get in close. No. If you want a nice close-up shot of that painting, you need to zoom with your feet. You need to walk closer to the image, and you need to essentially capture a series of different shots that will allow you to create what we call sequences. Now, in this particular PowerPoint, you can click on the image that you see here showing a guy holding a bolt of cloth, and this will give you a little bit more explanation of what we mean by creating sequences and why you want to avoid zooms. So I would highly recommend that you go ahead and click on this image and watch this story. it will explain to you that sequences are really a series of shots taken from wide perspective, more medium shots, and then lots and lots of close-ups. So to help understand sequences, how to shoot them, which will be very important in your next assignment, you should probably go ahead and watch this video, again linked here from this picture. Number 3, think about sequences. So as I've just said, most stories include multiple series of sequences to help tell the story. Most good stories in particular use multiple sequences. So when we're talking about the wide shot, sometimes it can be called the establishing shot. And the reason it's called the establishing shot is it gives the audience a sense of where the story takes place. So an establishing shot doesn't always have to be wide, but it is often wide. And our example here, you're shooting a story about a soccer game. You know, a picture of the entire soccer field is going to establish that that's your location. A medium shot brings you a little closer in on the action. So our example, the kids playing soccer on that same field. And then the close-up. So the foot hitting the soccer ball, the anxious parent on the sidelines, you know, watching, is her son going to score? All of these are types of shots that will get used in just about any story, and you will need to be shooting these types of shots for the assignment that you're about to do this week. Now, here is another example of a piece that's just worth watching, mainly because it's so funny, but secondarily because it gives you some insight into how to shoot for story. So one of the things that I think inexperienced journalists forget about when they're shooting video is that, you know, you're trying to illustrate what the story is about. And the best photojournalists essentially don't even need any words because they're so good at finding the images, moving or still, that tell the story that you don't even need words to see how the story progresses. And commercials often are terrific examples of this. With very limited language used, oftentimes you can send a very compelling message. So watch this video and I think you'll get a sense for how each of the individual images within this little commercial help tell a different part of the story. And so that's what you want to be doing when you're in the field, is looking for those images that help tell the story. So one of the things that is definitely featured in that commercial is both the action and the reaction. So the action being, you know, the pots falling, you know, the cat covered in tomato sauce, the guy picking up the cat, holding the knife, and the reaction from his girlfriend or wife as she walks in the door. Not every story is going to give you opportunities to get both action and reaction, but many stories will. You know, I think a classic example is the fire story. So oftentimes photojournalists get to the scene and it's all about shooting the flames, right? So you want to shoot the thing that's going to go away first. It just makes sense. But the best photojournalists, after they get the flame footage, is they turn the camera around and they start to capture the people observing the fire, whether that's homeowners or neighbors. It might be some of the firefighters are pausing to take a break and looking at, you know, the monumental task that they have in front of them. Those images help tell another very important part of the story. So a fire story is not just about flames, it's about the people whose lives are affected by the fire. So if you're out doing a story about CrossFit, you know, new type of a relatively new type of training new gym opening in Oxford, and that's your story. So you want to get the person, doing the pull-ups and the sit-ups and all that. But if there's somebody watching what's going on, that's also another good shot to get, because that tells part of the story as well. Another important part to think about when you're shooting your stories is try to come up with an interesting angle. Don't shoot it from eye level entirely. Move around. If you're in the back of the room shooting part of the story, move to the front of the room for the second half of the story. Get different points of view in terms of, we talked about shooting kids playing, just shoot their feet. Or if you are at a stadium and you're shooting the action on the field, don't just shoot everything from the sidelines. Get up high in the stands and shoot down on the field. So have an angle. If you're talking to kids, you want to be conducting your interviews with those kids at their level. So you might have to kneel down, or you might have to sit next to a child to do a good video interview with them. Climb up on something. Is there a pickup truck bed that you could get on and stand on and shoot a different angle on the thoroughfare of the carnival where all the rides are taking place? Because that's what good video journalists can do. They can take the viewers places that they wouldn't normally get to see. Another term that you'll hear used a lot when we talk about video is the concept of B-roll. So B-roll is an old film term, but for us, what we're talking about, it's the secondary or supplemental footage that you edit into your primary video to flesh out the story. So let's say you do an interview with one of the guys running the carnival games. So that interview is going to be compelling and interesting, but while he's talking about how difficult it is to win the games, you want to show video of someone attempting to win the game. So that's what we mean by B-roll. So it's the images that help explain what is being said either by the interviews that you conduct or by the words that you write for yourself or for a news anchor to read. So one of the keys to doing this well is to make sure that you give yourself time to shoot B-roll and try to brainstorm in advance what you're going to go after. So it's very difficult for you to, arrive on the scene 10 minutes before the speech is over, capture the last 5 minutes of the speech, and expect to be able to do a good story. So it takes planning, it takes thinking about the shots that you need. If you're doing the carnival story, you want to get that perspective shot showing us, what's the term? Sorry, I can't think of it. The game where all the games are set up at a carnival. You want to get a shot of that. The midway is what I'm thinking. So you want to get a shot of that. You also want to get a bunch of medium shots of people, throwing balls at the milk cans or, trying to shoot the basketballs. But then you want tons of close-ups of their faces as they intensely concentrate. You want shots of that basketball bouncing out of the rim. You want to see the money exchanging hands as they buy 3 more balls to try again. You want to see the joy on someone's face when they get the giant stuffed animal, or the disgust when they turn away from the game and they realize they've just wasted $10. So you have to think about what are the images that might be available to me, because by brainstorming it, you're much more likely to get those shots. Always shoot more than you think you'll need. Rule of thumb, it takes about 10 minutes of raw video or raw footage to produce 1 good solid minute of video content. So again, closer is often better. Stories are much more compelling when you can actually see the details that you're talking about or that your interviews are talking about. So in general, we try to recommend that you shoot 50% close-ups, 25% medium shots, and 25% wide shots. What I find is that most people, when they're shooting video, they're shooting 25% close-ups, 50% medium shots, and 25% wide shots. So they have it flipped, where you're spending a lot more time shooting medium shots because usually we feel more comfortable being about 8 to 10 feet away from something that we're shooting. It does, especially with a small camera, require you to oftentimes get right on top of someone or something to get a good close-up. The rule of thirds is number 4. Anyone who's ever had some photography classes or done work in photography, you know what I'm talking about here. So essentially the rule of thirds says you're going to divide the screen into thirds horizontally and vertically, and where you want the person to focus is here at the points of intersection. So when you're framing an interview with someone, you want them either framed looking to the screen left, or you want them framed looking slightly to the screen right. You always want to see both their eyes on the screen. So you don't want them in so much profile that you can't see both their eyes, but they should be angled slightly and they should be placed on one of the rule of thirds. So this is a great video link to help you explain or help explain to you the rule of thirds and what we're talking about. It's very relevant when you're shooting motion as well, is keeping more open space in front of the object that you're following than behind. So we're talking about framing here. You're basically trying to make sure that the video frame, what it is you want people to focus on, is following the rules of thirds. So this photo does not follow the rules of thirds. It has too much headroom, so it makes this guy look like he's very short and squat, and we have no idea if that's the case. So there's too much space between the top of his head and the top of the frame. He's also smack dab in the middle. He is angled slightly and looking off screen left. But this shot would be much better if he were positioned about right here and this were brought down to about right there. So give them that nose room or looking room. Apply the rule of thirds with about 1/3 of the frame above the eyes and 1/3 below the neck. So when you're shooting interviews, you want, again, to angle them slightly, but it should not be completely in profile. Also, be sure that you're not having, or be sure that you tell the subject not to look directly into the camera. Instead, have that person look at you. That can be a little tricky when you're shooting by yourself, but I have to say that most of the video interviews that I've seen all of you conduct, most of you do a pretty good job of this, of having the interview subject look at you and not directly into the camera. Number 5, beware the background. Okay, so this is definitely something that many still photographers have had happen to them, where you have a giant tree or building growing out of the back of your subject's head. With video, of course, you also want to avoid any kind of distractions that might be going on in the background. You know, if your story is not about traffic on a busy street, then you probably don't want to do your interview with a bunch of cars zooming in the background. Windows or glass doors can be a nightmare, especially with these small cameras where you can't really control the amount of light that the lens is allowing in. So if you are interviewing someone and there is a window behind that person, rearrange. Put them on the other side of their desk with you shooting with the light source behind you. Or move both of you out from behind the desk and shoot with the light source shining on their face, behind you and your camera, not behind their heads. Because otherwise you're going to end up with very poor lighting. In some cases, the person's not even really visible if the light source behind them is too intense. So don't be afraid to move. And in general, you want to choose a setting that, the office might be where they are most comfortable, but be sure that it's also enhancing the interview. So be sure that you're not essentially putting them somewhere where they have too much light coming from behind them, that there's too many, they have books piled to the moon behind them that look like they're about to topple over, or they've got a funny poster that's going to do nothing but distract the audience. Stick with your shots. So another common mistake is that when you're shooting video, make sure that each shot is at least 10 seconds long, and then stay on for about 5 seconds after that. So why is this? When you get to the editing process, if you have a bunch of very short 2 and 3 second clips, which I've seen inexperienced videographers do, it's going to be a nightmare when you go to edit, because you're not going to have any shots that last long enough for you to say the things you want to say about the visuals that are on the screen. So it makes your video editing much, much easier. And with digital, the possibilities are endless, right? If you don't like one of the clips, you delete it. It's very rare for anyone to fill up a memory card with so much video. So, it's not like you have to be, really hoarding the amount of digital space you have available for your video. Look for the light. So we've already talked about, lighting coming behind the person is bad. Lighting behind you, shining on the person that you're interviewing or the subject matter that you're shooting, good. So if it's in low light and you have a little higher end camera, one piece of advice is to expose for the background, not the foreground. If you're shooting outside and you can control the time of your shoot, high noon makes it more challenging. Mornings or afternoons, usually the light is a little bit more forgiving. If you can't control it, make sure that when you shoot, and you're trying to pull someone into the shade, make sure both you and your camera are in the shade, and that the bright light that might be outside the shade, so I'm thinking if you've brought someone underneath a portico, but if it's a very sunny day, again, that light source needs to be behind you, shining on that person's face. Otherwise, you're going to have the same problem you would if they were sitting in front of a window. Inside, watch out for windows. Turn on lights if you need to. Let's say you close a person's blinds. You probably want to turn on the lights in their office to control as best you can the lighting conditions. Focus on sound. For a lot of you, you're sort of setting yourself up for issues with sound by the very nature of the gear that you're using. So a smartphone and a flip cam and many of the smaller, still cameras that shoot video, they're using an internal microphone, and the sound is just not going to be as good as it could be if you had an external mic. So since sound is so important to good video storytelling, you need to get that mic, that internal mic, as close to the subject matter that you're shooting as possible. So same thing with being aware of visual distractions, you also need to be aware of sound distractions. Busy street, not a good place to interview someone. Wind can be a problem. You might have to turn your back on the wind or bring someone into a sheltered area between two buildings. And move your interview subject if you have to. I had a classic example of a student who was doing a story about music, about music venues kind of competing in the same city. And he went to a music store and interviewed someone, which was great, except they were blasting music in the background. So he was interviewing the store manager one of the strategies that he could have used would be to simply ask the manager, hey, could you turn down the music while we do this interview? Or you could bring the guy outside the store or into a back office where you could close the door, because it was just impossible to hear what the guy had to say because that music was so distracting. Now, in the professional world, with probably giving too much information, you're going to have the possibility of shooting with an external microphone. You're going to be shooting on 2 separate channels of audio, so you can control that background noise and have less background noise and more interview sound. But most of you, if not all of you, are shooting with gear that's essentially allowing you to record on 1 channel of audio. Seek the subjective. This gets to the interviews that you're conducting. So whenever possible, I try to ask my questions one at a time. And part of this is in the editing process. Oftentimes when people are answering 2 questions at once, they sort of intertwine the information that they were using to answer one question with the other question. It makes it just much more challenging in the editing process. And remember that subjective responses, so that emotion, expert opinion, those are the kinds of sound bites that work best in video stories. We don't really need the mayor to rattle off, the 5 new ordinances that are about to go into effect. Instead, you want to get the interview from the mayor about which of those 5 new ordinances he thinks is going to have the biggest impact and why. The hardest part about shooting video interviews is keeping your mouth shut when the person is responding. So why is this important? If somebody is answering your question about the most important new ordinance and how it's going to affect people, then we don't want to hear you in the background saying, really? Oh, wow, interesting. We just want to hear the sound from the person speaking. And number 10 is let the pictures drive. What I mean is that the best video storytellers look at their video and write to their pictures versus writing a story and then trying to find pictures to match. So I just was talking with a student who had a story about Social Security now being direct deposit only. And so they opened their story with something like, for thousands of seniors, the new policy about direct deposit is going to affect them, is going to raise concerns for them. The video we saw was someone an elderly person having their blood pressure taken. So a much better opening to that story would have been, for thousands of seniors, it's enough to raise your blood pressure. The federal government is changing the way it pays out Social Security funds. That does 2 things. 1, your video helps you write a more interesting opening to the story, and 2, it's reinforcing the information for the audience, right? So that kind of video referencing is what we call it, tends to make much better stories. So again, this is an opportunity for you to click and watch this story from the New York Times, shot on a smartphone, but a very compelling story, and you will see the way in which the reporter lets the pictures drive the story.